Good morning, everybody. It's Tuesday, and glad to have you here with us on a Tuesday morning. Yesterday we had a great show. Really happy with it. We had Mary Ellen Summerlin here and talking about the city council race. And an interesting day yesterday from the news perspective. We had the Commissioner's Court, always fun to watch. Essentially, the county is going to defer the responsibility of communicating the vaccine to Peterson Health. That came out yesterday. They were supposed to do a press release, and of course, that didn't happen. And Peterson was hoping to stand this thing up today. So the goal was that you were going to pre-register on this thing and get information about the vaccine, get in line for the vaccine when it comes out there. But yesterday was one of those days where I kind of dug around some things and I was like, interesting, folks. That is not really true. And that has been the story of, to me, the year when it comes to dealing with the coronavirus in Kerr County. The narrative was that there were 3,400 people that had to be vaccinated here in Kerr County that were the healthcare workers. And that is not true. There was only 2,100, according to DSHS. Now, who knows if DSHS is right? They've been wrong always on this thing. But that's what they're saying. Essential frontline workers, in Kerr County was 2,100. If you added up all of the people together, including those in nursing homes, which I think are vaccinated on a different level or a different agency, then you'd have maybe 3,400, but you don't. So again, it's like it's this messaging failure on the part of the county that makes me crazy. And again, another meeting went by where they didn't say, well, this happened and that happened. People died. The other day they put a press release out that said someone died on February 4th. That did not happen. It did not happen. All you have to do is download the publicly available data to do that. Okay. I will promise that I would not get into this with you guys today, but that's where we're at. I do want to touch on, for a second here, one of the things that we are seeing is a decline in, and Don Frazier's here, by the way, from the Texas Center over at Schreiner University, and we're going to talk to Don about really cool things. I'm really excited about this conversation. It may go long. I don't know. We may go all day, but I'm looking forward to this. But I do want to touch upon this. I follow this epidemiologist on Twitter, and he's really fascinating. And his name is Eric Feigl-Ding, and he is a Harvard guy. And he's following what's going on in Europe again. And remember, we're finally at a rate where we're actually seeing some light here, right? But the problem with COVID-19 is that this thing is insidious. It really, really is, and you can't take it for granted for a second. Which is probably why I should never gone down to Bandera in the first place for the gigantic Mardi Gras thing they had. So because people are just like, first off, we're sick of hearing about COVID. And then they don't really realize that this thing is insidious and it is behaving in ways that they don't quite understand fully. And so, and I said this morning, it's like, you think about science for a minute. Things we take for granted scientifically, we didn't know about a lot of this stuff until like after World War II, like how an earthquake was formed. That wasn't something we really knew about until after World War II. So I mean, things we take for granted, there's still a lot we don't know. And when it comes to this virus, what they're seeing is that one of the things they were saying is that some of these people who have long-term hospitalizations, the suggestion was that they are seeing multiple mutations in the bodies of those who have been in hospitals for a long time, and that the virus is trying to work its way around Regeneron, which is what President Trump got, to attack your immune system in a more efficient way. So there's two variants they're very concerned about, and one of them apparently does attack children more aggressively, and this is the one from South Africa, which now is in Austria. Austria has seen a significant outbreak in kindergartens and in the military. And remember, it likes to be close to people. So this is a problem. And Austria is actually going to probably end up closing its borders to keep people from passing it along. It's that infectious. So, quote, this is incredibly worrisome for Austria, which was highly dependent on the AstraZeneca vaccine. AstraZeneca's vaccine has been basically defeated by this variant, but AstraZeneca is now recognized to be not very effective against B1351, which is the South African variant of this, especially mild or moderate illness, severe yet unknown. And they're now saying that it's like 22% effective, one of these vaccines, against this newest variant of this. So the good news is that, what we're seeing here, in Kerrville is we're seeing a decline in cases. We're seeing a decline in hospitalizations. We only had 6 people hospitalized yesterday. We had 6 consecutive days of people of under 10, which is the first time since October that's happened. It basically had 10 days or 10 people or more hospitalized every day since November 1st. And now we're finally back down. Actually, this is the first time this happened since October 22nd, where they've had that many days in a row with people with under 10. So that gives you the scale of what Peterson's been under for the last few months. And they still weathered it, which is amazing. So, hats off to them and hats off to the work they're doing done. And so, like I said, the message out there from this on this virus has always been, we don't know what we don't know, but just say that. Why do you have to make up stuff? Oh, we don't know. We got to get all these people. We don't. The one that drives me crazy. In fact, Mary Ellen Summerlin and I talked about this yesterday, was the notion that the state, the text that we didn't know anything about this hub thing. You did. It was in October. You were told in October that they're going to do hubs, and there wasn't going to be enough vaccine. So I don't understand it. But anyway, good morning, Delane. Good morning, Barbara. How are you guys? I'm going to stop. Delane gets mad at me when I rant about COVID, and I'm afraid of Delane. So I'm gonna. She's the host on Thursday show, so I'm gonna behave myself and go on to other things real quick. 2 things I want to touch upon as we move forward here. There's an apartment complex that is being proposed for Holdsworth Drive, and that got the unanimous a resolution passed yesterday from the county. The thing will go to the city council tonight, and this apartment complex would be basically low-income housing. The same developer is doing one that's similar for senior housing over on Lehman Drive, where they get these tax credits from the state to build these projects. This is a big one, though, I think, for Holdsworth Drive. It'll be interesting to talk to Bruce Strachey about what that means for Holdsworth, because that's kind of been that area kind of west of Paschal and, west of the, what is that? Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. But it's over there by the baseball fields. And that whole area is kind of ripe for development at this point in Kerrville. So this new apartment complex, they're competing for it. Doesn't mean it's a done deal yet. The county passed a resolution supporting it. The city will pass a resolution tonight supporting it most likely, and then they'll get this. But it's another 48 units for people who are basically, it's not Section 8 housing. I want to clarify that. It's low-income housing and there's certain caps where they're at with this. So many houses for those who have this income level, or apartments for this income level, and then they work it out. And this company does this all over the country. They do it. They've done 6 states now. They're from Kansas. But look out for that one tonight. And then tonight at the city council meeting, they're going to give out heroism awards for 2 people. One, this guy, Cody Langening, who stopped a stabbing attack at the subway last month. And then another woman who used a tire iron to stop her friend from being beaten to death. So bold and brave citizens. Chris McCall, the police chief, who we're going to effort to get on the show at some point. And I'll make sure that Karen Guerrero takes care of that. She's been booking the show for me as well. So there you go. Tomorrow, Marty Leonard will be on the show. We'll talk to him about, it's like a Schreiner Fest here, So we're going to have that on there as well. Good morning to Sandy. Don, Sandy Wolfmuller saying hello. How many books have you purchased from Wolfmuller's during the epic retirement sale? Have you been over there to clear them out?
There's an entire aisle I would like.
Which aisle would that be?
That would be the history aisle over there against the wall.
Right.
But yeah, I've bought probably under half a dozen.
Half a dozen?
Because I've got a pile of about 4,000 books over at the Texas.
Right. So, I have a pile of books I still need to read.
That's absolutely. You'll never read the last one.
I know, and you'll never get done with them all. I did clear out. This is my recent purchases. I did clear out. I bought a Phil Sheridan autobiography from 1880 something.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, got that one. I also got a Grant collection, a first edition of the Grant biography, autobiography, which is like one of the best reads ever.
Oh yeah, his autobiography is really well done.
It's really funny actually. Sometimes it's so funny that you're like, you didn't write this, did you? That's why I always think to myself, Samuel Clemens was back there, was like John, a little bit, because he was the publisher of the. People don't realize that Mark Twain was the publisher of that book.
You bet.
But the funniest element of this was Grant's at West Point, and there was a move to actually abolish West Point, and in the autobiography, Grant writes that he's really hopeful that would happen.
Well, Davy Crockett was one of the guys that was really pushing for abolishing West Point.
Oh,
it's a bastion of privilege.
Interesting.
Yeah.
A common man. We have a lot to talk about today. First off, tell us a little bit about the Texas Center.
We're rolling, man.
What's going on? Tell us all about it, though.
Well, we've got we're starting to produce content in our studio, putting that stuff up online.
Okay.
Some of it is a little hamstrung because of restrictions because of COVID-19,
right.
But we're doing our level best to get all that done. We're attracting a lot of statewide attention. We're getting ready to help with the Western Art Academy, which is going to roll out this summer. God willing, and COVID don't rise,
right?
As they say. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff going on. I've been doing a lot of live streaming webinars and seminars from the Texas Center. So it's keeping us really busy.
So this kind of stuff, you can do it yourself now. You can run your own show. Yeah. Basically, that's what you're doing. That's great.
Yeah, I don't know, man. A show like this is a hungry beast that always has to be
to be fed, right? Exactly. That's what I was telling somebody yesterday. I said, they're like, well, how are you doing on this? I said, they asked me about content and how do you maintain it? And I said, it is exactly that. It's insatiable.
Yeah.
You've got to constantly put it out there. The Texas Center is that going to be the permanent home of that where you're at now in Schreiner? Is it going to be moved to another location? I guess I'm a little confused sometimes about what the future looks like and how bright it really looks.
Well, sure. I mean, it's the facility we have now is a great facility for where we are now.
Right.
This is where we start, though. I don't think this is where we will end up.
Right.
Because we've got a big chore ahead of us. And one of the things that we're working on now is kind of a K through 16 approach to Texas history. And essentially, we're identifying a need out there in the marketplace and in the education sphere for some sort of honest, straight up history on Texas that's not skewed one way or the other. It's not hagiographic where Davy goes down swinging and everybody has noble and pure purposes, but it's also not all about what you're hearing coming from the major state universities right now, which is, it's all about white supremacy, Indian genocide, and land stealing.
Right.
So somebody's got to, kind of tell that story that is a wide-eyed story and takes into account some of the excesses of the past, but also is ultimately optimistic about what Texas does really, really well.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I think one of the things I tell about people all the time, there's this debate about American exceptionalism, and I said American exceptionalism to me is to admit that you're wrong.
Yeah.
And if we can have an honest conversation about the wrongs and the rights, and for every wrong that was committed, I'm a big fan of Helen Hunt Jackson, and she was an author, and Helen Hunt Jackson, stood up for Indian rights. So
absolutely.
I mean, there was
Century of Dishonor, man.
Right, Century of Dishonor. The seminal book, about what was going on with and it confronted this, and so it said, we need to do a better job of this. So for every sort of, I think there's two sides of this deal where you have, yes, this did happen. But there were people who were aware of it too. There are people who were fighting against this as well, and so
absolutely,
I think you're right. I mean, I grew up in California, and we were told the missions were really cool, and without the context of, well, they really were sort of slave plantations more than anything,
Well, or they could have been considered culture factories.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
We take your culture, we strip it away from you, and then we rebuild you in our image.
Right, exactly. And so, I mean, that's a difficult conversation to have. when you look at Texas history, it has been volatile at times, right? To talk about.
Absolutely. I mean, Texas's real estate is not exactly what I would call A1.
Right.
It's not desirable real estate. Any place that only has one natural lake and we have to split it with Louisiana, probably tells you what some of the challenges are going to be.
Right.
I mean, getting a drink of water was a tough chore back in the day. So,
wow. And when you look at the history of it, I didn't realize, the one biggest one you talk about now too is the Texas Rangers. Have a much more sordid history than people probably would like to admit. But at the same time, though, there's probably as many good stories about the Rangers as there are bad stories.
Oh, sure. I mean, the excesses are what everybody's pointing to now, and the excesses were pretty doggone rugged.
Yeah.
They were operating in a very, very violent and volatile time, essentially trying to keep the U.S. border intact in the middle of the Mexican Revolution.
Right.
And then you have things like the Plan de San Diego, which is
a secession movement.
Yeah, it's not only a secession movement, but a genocide movement in its own mark against anybody that's not of Mexican-American heritage. So there was a lot of meanness going on.
Yeah.
And hard men took a hard stand, and a lot of people that were innocent were killed.
Right. And I think that's something that people now are starting to kind of come to terms with too. It's like, this is. I mean, I think every part of America has some kind of horrific story of to get to where you're at. It's not always a pretty story there.
It's not always a pretty story, but I mean, you can say that about every square inch of planet Earth.
Yeah,
if there's human beings involved, there's probably somebody being crummy to somebody else.
Right. What was it? I'm trying to remember. I can't remember what movie it was from, but it was a great thing about the Sioux. I don't remember what movie. I'm picturing it in my head. And it's like. The comment, and it's totally true, and it was like, the Sioux came out of, were fairly new to the plains in the 1860s, came out of were thrown out of Minnesota, and came out and dominated the plains, and pushed out, Native American tribes, out of there. So
absolutely, it's a human story. We go if you're talking about the Sioux, they go from living in earth huts and growing pumpkins, which is not exactly a Dances with Wolves image of the Sioux.
No, right.
But once they figure out that the horse is a pretty doggone decent weapons platform, they can dominate their neighbors.
Right.
Same story with the Comanche.
Yeah.
The problem with the sort of sentimental view, especially of the indigenous peoples of the continent, is you take away their human agency.
Yeah.
Which is they have the same wants, needs, and desires as you and I do. And the rules were different for them because of their circumstances, their place, their time. And the Comanches were an imperial power that displaced other folks. I mean, right outside this window was probably occupied by wandering bands of Lapon Apache.
Right.
And the Lapon Apache were down here because they got thrown out of the neighborhood by the Comanches from the north. So, and then finally the Comanches met their match, and they had their time in the sunshine, and then they faded.
Right.
Talking about that too is the Comanches. There's never more than about 10,000 of them.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you just do the arithmetic, when you have 6 million Texans and you have 10,000 Comanches, sooner or later the Comanches are not going to be around.
Not going to be around, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
So.
The biggest issue I think that we're dealing with right now is this notion of Texas secession, which is now in the legislature again, and a tough one. I know. I'm sorry to throw this at you, but there was some rudimentary support of it from one of our representatives here, Angie Murr. But I did some research on it, and basically, I guess the idea is that the Civil War pretty much decided, the legality of secession, and then a Supreme Court decision in 1869 with Texas involved, white versus Texas, or Texas versus white, decided that that the Confederacy had no right to do what they did. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this, and how do you explain that historically?
Well, that's smack dab in the middle of what I've been thinking about for the last 30 years. Not the secession of Texas, but secession as a historical phenomenon.
Right.
And so secession, I'll just state it straight up, is a terrible idea. The United States is much better together.
Right.
Now, that said, what you're seeing is an expression of frustration with an overreaching federal government.
Right.
And so Texas has always been a bastion of the 10th Amendment. And I think the 10th Amendment sometimes gets run over rather liberally.
Right.
So I get what people are saying. I think secession's the wrong way to do it. Mm-hmm. Now, Civil War solved it, and settled it at the point of the bayonet. But I would point out that Jefferson Davis was never tried.
Right.
And the reason he was never tried is because, and if you read his absolutely unreadable papers and memoirs, Jeff Davis had a pretty doggone good constitutional reason why secession was legal, mm-hmm. but it wasn't ironclad.
Right.
So ultimately, ironclads.
Civil
War pun.
Right. No.
And bayonet solved the issue, and so secession is not something that you can just glibly go into.
Right.
And I don't think everybody's going to give back their Social Security checks.
No.
And they're not going to be happy when all the air bases and Army bases leave.
Right.
And, when the border becomes our issue alone.
Right.
And
I think one thing I stood out for me. I remember when my son went through basic training. Graduated from basic training. In the Navy. And I was like, I was struck by two things. Well, struck by the greatness of the ceremony, but secondly, the Navy would not exist if it wasn't for two states, basically Texas and California. The bulk of those who were enlisted were from those two states. Two of the most populous states in the Union. And it's just an interesting sort of So yeah, you're better together. You may not like California if you're a Texan, but it's kind of a symbiotic relationship in a lot of ways.
It is. California can do all the stuff that we would be loath to do.
Right.
And we can watch them in all their craziness as we're munching their grapes.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So, Every time I go to the grocery store these days, I remind myself, well, this is in Bakersfield. This is from Bakersfield. This is from Bakersfield.
Yeah.
So the grapes and the wine and all of the things. And I think one of the things that's an underlying story, too, is that Texas and California are actually more close than they think. They may not agree politically, but the symbiotic relationship in the tech industry, yeah, you're getting these companies relocate, but the reality of it is that they're relocating because there's talent here, and there's affordability here, and there's things that are here. So I think Texas has some growing pains that are going to happen here real quick here, but it's an interesting story for sure. When you look at Texas's history, would you say this is the golden era of Texas history right now, this middle period, just from the standpoint of the growth and the impact and the population expansion, the expansion of the big cities? Arguably some of the things that are happening here, especially in Austin, are making one of the world's leading tech hubs. I mean, it's an interesting time to say the least.
Yeah, and the thing about golden eras of anything is you never realize you're in a golden era
until you go right
until you look back nostalgically. So it's probably too early to tell.
Yeah.
But I will say something about California and Texas. Politically, California and Texas are more closely aligned if you excise San Francisco and Los Angeles County.
Right.
And so those are the tails that wag that California dog politically. So a bunch of those guys are refugeeing over to Texas because Texas is more business friendly, and I get that. I was in a meeting on Saturday with a group called the Texas Philosophical Society, the oldest learned organization in the state of Texas.
Wow.
Founded by Maribel B. Lamar and Sam Houston, and just so happens I'm an elected member.
Nice.
It's a pretty exclusive bunch. And so I was listening to Tom Luce, who's former Secretary of Education, Kay Bailey Hutchinson, and then also the director of the Fed up in Dallas. And they were talking about Texas in 2050. And the thing that they see as big challenges is workforce preparation.
Yeah.
And also making Texas immigrant friendly without yielding any of that business friendliness that has made Texas great.
Right.
So there is such a thing as structured liberty, which I think is what Texas has done pretty well. But there's all of a sudden a growing rift within the state between the urban centers and the rest of the state.
Right.
the way it was voiced on Saturday in this meeting was that the urban centers tend to lean more towards a federal alignment, whereas Texas has historically been a little more about self-sufficiency.
Right.
And so there is this sort of disjoint between the urban centers and the folks in, say, Kerr County. And that's going to have to be worked out. And, you know, other states are taking a look at the mad genius of Texas and going, wait, why can't we do that here?
Yeah.
And so Texas is right now in a very dominant position in terms of being a place where people want to come and do business. But sooner or later, other states, as they look around and there's nobody in their office buildings, are going to wake up and say, what can we do to reverse this sort of
Yeah, California has, you know, I look at it from a perspective of, and I grew up in a rural, what was at the time a rural part of California, east of Los Angeles, where, you know, agriculture dominated the landscape to that point, you know, citrus and dairy and things like that.
What
Riverside
sure.
County.
Yeah.
So, you know, and now it's not.
Yeah.
Now it's urban, and it used to be a stronghold of Republican politics. It was dependably Republican, and now it's not because of the way that the demographics have shifted. And you know, basically, you know, people don't realize, you know, there's 28 million people that live in Southern California, the same size of the population of Texas. Yeah. And, you know, they're getting the hell out of there. It's too crowded, you know. And that's one of the things like the pandemic I think is going to do for people is like, you know, I don't want to be in a place where maybe it doesn't align with my politics, but also it's so crowded, you know. I think the growing pains for Texas really are around that you see it, you know. I see it when I go to San Antonio. I think to myself all the time, it's like, man, this feels like, you know, Southern California in a lot of places because of the expansion outward.
Yeah, the exurbs.
You know, the exurbs are getting bigger. Yep. Like, I kind of know now, but I didn't used to really know, like, well, is this Bernie or what is this? You know, is this San Antonio now? Where are we? And it's starting to get bigger and bigger and push outward. And I think that those growing pains are coming. I mean, I think a lot of places are going to, you know, Phoenix is that way too.
Sure.
And I can see Albuquerque being that way as well. And so it's just going to be an interesting period as well. Let's go back to talking a little bit about, you know, your relationship. The first time I met you, we had a great conversation about your work with Phil Collins in the Alamo. Was the Alamo your gateway drug to Texas history, or was it something else?
It was probably the Marx playset.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Okay. All right.
And, you know, my gateway drug was, you know, driving across the miles and miles of miles and miles at Mark, Texas.
Right.
And Dad was one of those sort of polymaths who could tell you about geology, geography, agriculture, history as we're driving along. So it was windshield history the whole time.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, we didn't have a DVD player in the headrest in the back seat. As we, you know, poking
You had to watch,
Yeah, you had to look out the window and count telephone poles.
Yeah.
And so that was really the gateway drug, was the landscape itself.
Yeah.
And then, you know, you start playing with Army men when you're a kid, and you're going, wow, these are really heroic stories that I'm being told here, and interesting stories, the drama. And that was really the gateway drug, but it was trying to figure out what Texas did in the Civil War is what launched me into my professional career.
Right.
And it was actually just walking along a cemetery in Macon, Georgia, on the banks of the Ocmulgee River. Okay. And there was 13 dead Texans in this cemetery.
Oh, wow.
Were all dead Confederates. And it occurred to me to ask the question, you know, how did these guys end up dead here? Right. So far from home, and that just kind of, you know, good history comes from good questions. Right. And I started having a series of good questions early on. Yeah. And it's been a lifetime in answering.
I don't think I told you the story, but we had a guy, when I was at the Kerrville Daily Times, a guy called up and he said, you need to run a correction. And I said, okay. And what was the story? Well, it's from 1941. And it was a guy here who claimed that he was a Gettysburg survivor, and he had died at 100 years old. And apparently this guy was not a Civil War. He did not fight in the Civil War, but he assumed his father's identity to collect the pension that was offered Confederate soldiers from Texas in the 1890s, I guess. And then he eventually died in 1941. He lived in Kerrville for a while. And the Kerrville Times, matter of fact, says, "Oh yeah, he bragged about being at Gettysburg." And the beauty of our time now is that you can kind of like go back and find the regimental.
Oh yeah, I can look up that guy's service record.
It's like, wait a minute here. He says that he was in the artillery. There was no artillery units from Texas at Gettysburg.
Correct.
It was just John Bell Hood's, infantry, battalions who probably got mauled. I would think. Wouldn't you think? What was the casualty rate of some of those guys who were in Hood's army?
Oh yeah, Hood's brigade got chewed up.
Yeah.
1st, 4th, and 5th Infantry. They went up through Devil's Den,
Right.
up against Little Round Top, so
Yeah.
they caught it in the neck.
Yeah.
But yeah, there were no Texas artillery units there.
Yeah.
And there was only one Texas artillery unit that was east of the river, really. So.
Yeah, I mean, from what I could tell, this guy they never really left, Texas for the most part. But he was telling this, and people just believed it,
Yeah,
and so,
sure, because people don't know.
Right.
And yeah, as far as Texas in the Civil War, it was largely a west of the Mississippi phenomena. Mm-hmm. And I would say probably somewhere between 60 and 70% of the Texans that left their homes for service, either willingly or through conscription or just ahead of the conscription officer, served west of the Mississippi River.
Do you ever, one of the things I've been to a few Civil War battlefields now. It's taken me a long time to get there, but I've been to Cold Harbor and I've been to Petersburg, a few of them, and I was so tempted to. We were on a trip back to Virginia in June, and we drove through Tennessee, and I wanted to stop at Shiloh, but just wasn't time for it, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I mean, would you ever think to yourself, like, God, how miserable it must have been to be in the Confederacy by 1860, late 1864, early 1865? Because a lot of those guys were starving. I can't even imagine some of the things they must have gone through.
Oh yeah, it was a miserable, dark, and just crummy time.
Yeah.
And people that say, "Man, we ought to." Secede, or we ought to have another Civil War. Mm-hmm. They haven't a clue on what that looks like at the granular level, as they say. What has fascinated me, and I've always been interested in sort of the untold stories of the Civil War, is how absolutely gritty the Civil War period was right here in Kerr County, Gillespie County. Oh yeah, Kendall County is just nuts, and people were really brutal to each other.
Yeah.
I go up past Goat Creek Road, and I'm reminded of people that were hanged there. There's a mass grave in Comfort that everybody knows about, but there's a whole different mass grave down in Bandera.
Oh, wow.
And so one of the things that the Wolfmullers have really helped me with is pointing me to the sources of the Civil War in the Hill Country. Actually, there's a new book out by UT Press that's, I think, called The Civil War in the Hill Country.
Oh, really?
Catchy title, yeah.
Because you had the Germans who were sort of resistant of the idea. They didn't want to be. My understanding is that they didn't want to. Correct me. You're the expert, but my understanding was that they didn't want to be engaged with conscription because that's what they were leaving Germany for.
Yeah, they left Germany so they wouldn't get frog marched into the Prussian army or the French army or the Austrian army.
Right.
And so they came here and moved out into the sticks so that they could have a life of the mind. Most of these guys were college educated. They were well read. They called themselves the Latiners because they could read stuff in Latin and they'd have debates in Latin. So that's the strange juxtaposition here in the Hill Country.
Right.
Is if you're
German free thinkers, right?
Yeah, you had these Germans speaking Latin with a German accent in a log cabin in Gillespie County or Kerr County, and you're just scratching your head like, what planet have I landed on,
Right.
But these guys understood what the Civil War was about, and they didn't want anything to do with it.
Yeah.
I mean, that just wasn't their fight.
Right.
And they formed self-defense units with the unfortunate name of the Union Loyal League, which kind of telegraphed their intentions.
Right.
But they really didn't make any moves one way or the other. They were just telling everybody, back up, we're armed and we'll defend ourselves. The Confederates planted a mole in their organization, which they discovered. They capped him. They shot him. And then all of a sudden, word got back to the Confederate authorities in San Antonio. These guys are more of a threat than we think.
Right.
So they came up and busted some heads and, scattered them. A bunch of them fled, got run down at the Battle of the Nueces, which we know about in August of 1862. But what's really interesting to me is you think about some of the big names from the Hill Country. Schreiner's one, but almost Nimitz.
Yeah.
Also Nimitz over in Fredericksburg. So where were the Nimitz in the middle of all this?
Yeah, right.
And it turns out that the Germans, after they got roughed up in '62, the Confederates ended up having bigger fish to fry elsewhere, and so the Germans formed another self-defense unit. There's about 7 companies of Germans.
Wow.
That were ostensibly Confederate companies, but they never left their home counties.
Wow. Never. They kind of, all right, we'll play nice. Just leave us the hell alone, basically.
Yeah, that's right. We're no longer the Union Loyal League. We are the Confederate Non-Offensive League, And so that's essentially how they made their time. They spent their time. They survived during the course of the Civil War, and that's what Nimitz's granddad, who had such a big influence on him, the future admiral, that's how he got around it. But what ends up happening is you have a just sort of this vacuum of authority and any sort of legal control in this region. So you got bandits and heel flies and all sorts of bad guys that have to be dealt with. So it's a rugged time to be in the hill country.
One of the things I find interesting about the Civil War, and is the global perception of the United States at that point. I'm sure there were people in Great Britain who were like, oh, good, they're going to blow up.
Yeah.
But I mean, by 1864, I have to think that there was people who were smart who were thinking to themselves, my God, look at what they're doing, with when it comes to, I read a great book called Iron Dawn, which is about how, how the USS Monitor, the ironclad, was built in New York City, and how many innovations were invented in 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't hardly do it today.
Right, you couldn't. I mean. Like there was enough foundries and smart people within all along, I guess, along the Hudson there.
Immigrants, I would point
out. Right? From all over the world came in there. Like, okay, well, we need to do a turret. You need to do this. You need to do that. And they went to and then I'm blanking on the name of the guy that Erickson, right? Yeah. The architect, the naval architect, who just figured out how to build this thing. But they must have been watching in horror, because not only did you see, the scale of the United States Army by 1864 is just enormous.
It is absolutely enormous.
I mean, it dwarfed anything that was in Europe at that point, maybe even thereafter.
Absolutely. So the U.S. Army balloons, but the U.S. Army is still a second-rate army in terms of its quality compared to its European counterparts. Mm-hmm. So the weapon systems were backwards. The Navy was backwards. Right. Even with things like the Monitor, they were still not at the cutting edge of the arms race internationally.
Right.
While the Americans are, toying with the idea of issuing breech loaders,
right,
because it burns so much ammo, and ammo's expensive.
Right.
The European powers not only have breech loaders, but they have center fire guns.
Yeah. Right.
So
right.
They have figured out the arms race because they have so many neighbors that they need to kill.
Right
at hand. And so the Americans were a bunch of rubes that just took to wailing on each other.
Yeah.
And the Europeans are going, oh, man, the country cousins are beating each other again.
Right, right.
And so they tried to make hay out of it the best they could, and the French came closest to being successful.
But by the end of the war, though, you've got this gigantic army. A lot of them do. I mean, there is some movement there. Basically Grant sends 50,000 troops down to the border at one point, heavily armed, veteran troops,
bringing 3 muskets for every man, and they just happen to throw 2 of them over the river to the Watasistas.
Right, right, yeah. So it's an interesting time at all, to see what was accomplished in that period. And what's amazing to me, though, talking about untold story of the Civil War, is like the war's going on, but there's like guys like Rockefeller who are figuring out how to make billions on oil. Vanderbilt, all these guys are doing. We'll worry about the war later. We're going to build this. We're going to build refineries.
Even in the South, there were landowners that took advantage of their neighbors who couldn't pay their taxes in a highly depreciated scrip.
Right.
And so they were buying up all their neighbors' property at tax sales.
Wow.
At tax auctions on the courthouse square. Rich folks exploited the poor folks. It's a tale as old as time.
When you look at the history of Texas, obviously the Alamo is the one that comes up the most, and you've done a lot of work with the Alamo. But I mean, again, what do you find to be the most fascinating period? The Civil War period?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, it's that middle period that really kind of sets the tone. But then there's these sort of watershed events, Spindletop, when petroleum becomes the single largest thing in Texas.
Yeah.
That changes the entire trajectory of the state. The role of the military and World War II and the establishment of bases in Texas changes a lot of the landscape as well.
Yeah.
So it's always dramatic at these turning points.
Yeah.
And the Civil War is probably the turning point that I focus on the most. But, there's so much. And frankly, that's, you asked about the Golden Age and some of the growing pains. One of the things that the Texas Center is really big about is trying to bring this sort of full-bodied Texas story to the folks that are moving in. So, you come in from Bakersfield, but, hey, let me tell you, the story that you're stepping into now and get you up to speed on it, and that way you can write your own Texas story.
Right. The, what were you doing before, and how'd you get this job? I love this story.
What would you say you do here?
Wait, what do you do? What do you do here? What were you doing before?
Well, I was a classroom history professor for a quarter of a century.
Right.
At another school elsewhere in the state. Okay. And pretty frustrated, frankly. And on the side, we had started a nonprofit, the McWinney Group, which included a publishing firm, State House Press. Okay. We were doing tours. We did all sorts of history tours all over the state of Texas, all over the country, all over Europe, and even to the South Pacific. Yeah. I mean, I took a group diving off Guadalcanal. Wow. So, it was, to me, history was so interesting and just was an adventure a minute that just teaching a bunch of semi-motivated 18 to 21-year-olds was not really, clicking all the levers for me. Did it, happy to do it, changed lives, stamped out ignorance, Yeah, right. Everybody has a role to play. But I was always thinking more entrepreneurially than the typical history faculty. Right. And sometimes that got me into, crosswise with administrators where I was, because they were going, you got one thing, you have one job, and that is to go get these kids through, from point A to point B in your history classes. And here you are wanting to start a press, and here you are wanting to start field trips. And, the only place that I ever found that encouraged me to do that was Schreiner University. Okay. And Charlie McCormick and I crossed paths in one of my various adventures, and he watched what I was doing, and he said, "Look, I'd like to get a big bottle of whatever it is you're selling." Yeah. And he tried to get me down here to Schreiner, but at the time, my daughter had just made varsity cheerleader at a 6A high school in West Texas, which meant that she was, an ascended being, not necessarily a deity, but certainly a demigod. And so I wasn't going to yank her out of that context and throw her into a new environment. Right. So, there was about a 5-year incubation period where Charlie decided if I was what he really wanted, and I decided if Schreiner was what I really wanted. Right. And turns out, yes and yes. And nice. So my kids got out of the house, went off to college. They were, getting launched, and it was a time for a change. Yeah. Otherwise, I was just going to sit and look out my window in Abilene, wondering what might have been. And I came down here, and Charlie says, what might be? This is what we're going to do. Yeah, this is what we're going to do.
There's a spirit of optimism at Schreiner that I really like.
This school's about to bust out. Yeah. And, you heard it from me first. If you haven't heard it from somebody else first. Yeah. This is a great unknown gem in the state of Texas. And the fact that this is the only university in the state of Texas that is really taking this mission to educate Texans about Texas seriously is remarkable. Right. And it's unduplicatable in the state. And so I think that the Texas Center is just part of a much broader Schreiner story, and we're moving on a lot of different fronts. And it's almost like the place and the hour have met.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So. Yeah, I interviewed a young woman on Friday she was a tennis player at Schreiner. Yeah. And technically was in her junior year, but she had graduated early, and she was like, I'm ready to go, but you know what? Something's calling me back. I want to play tennis. I want to be at Schreiner just for one more semester. Then I'm going to go do my graduate program. Yeah. And I thought that to be a very optimistic and a very telling story about what some of these kids think about Schreiner too once they're there.
It's strange. There is a strange magic there that I haven't experienced in my professional career. You know, a lot of kids go off to a state university and it's very workmanlike. And they go and they have their undergraduate education, by and large, with TAs and adjuncts. And then if they go to graduate school, they may get a full professor who has all sorts of accolades. But really, at most state universities, you're being taught by the B team, and the C team, right, and the fill-ins. But at Schreiner, there is this sort of strange alchemy between the professors and the students, and the location and the administration that is really cool to watch. Right. You know, and I've got kind of a ringside seat. I'm not in the arena because the Texas Center doesn't necessarily engage as aggressively in undergraduate education as I have in the past. Right. But it's, from my vantage point, it is a really remarkable place.
Interesting. When you look at your own personal Texas story, how deep does it go?
My own personal Texas story goes back to about the 1850s. Okay. You know, son of immigrants. Like everybody else, but in this case, it's immigrants from East Tennessee or immigrants from Scotland. Right. And it's a pretty typical Texas story that goes through the various generations. You know, they're not coming here with privilege. They're not coming here with a particular axe to grind. Well, I say that. The Scots came here because the Presbyterian Church had gotten way too liberal back in Scotland. So they came to Texas where they could still worship God the way he intended. Exactly. And then the folks that came in through from Tennessee to northwest Arkansas to central Texas, they were down here to trade horses, buy horses in Mexico, trade them to the army up and down the frontier. And so it's a real typical Texas story. Yeah. And nothing remarkable. I'm not one of the old 300 settlers or descended from them or anything like that. But we came when
we came at some point.
Yeah, we came when we came. And then after the Civil War, my mother's family all came here because, you know, Georgia was wrecked, Mississippi was wrecked, and Texas was the land of opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, I recently discovered my mother's my mother was adopted after World War II, and we discovered her sort of family history. And it has, you know, one of the things I always tell people too is like, at some point in your life, in your family history, some kind of historical cataclysm will affect your family. Sure, absolutely. And for her, it was not beyond her mother's side. It was the loss of a family patriarch at the Battle of Chickamauga that changed the trajectory of that family. I mean. And so, I mean, like you mentioned too, like, you know, the arrival of military bases during World War II, that single-handedly kept my grandfather out of World War II, you know, because there was so much work to be done just getting these bases ready that he had deferments, you know, and whereas his brother went right into the Marines and right to the Pacific. And so, because he had a skill, he was kept here stateside. So. Yeah. It's interesting though, you know, like that. Do you think about that too? Like, you know, what are the historical moments, you know, in your own family that stand out, you know, that affected your family in some capacity?
Oh yeah, I mean, everybody's life has these turning points, and in the Scottish immigrant side of my family, you know, they came over because of a land scheme. Yeah. So you're familiar with the artist George Catlin, right? All right. So George Catlin couldn't sell art. He could paint a lot of really cool art. Yeah. Just nobody was buying after a while. So he had to end up becoming a hawker for immigrant companies. And so he got about 10 Indians, and they went and toured northern England and southern Scotland and convinced people to come to the United States. And there was a British admiral that was also kind of a land speculator that got involved in that as a celebrity sort of backer. And they were looking to settle somewhere in the United States, and they'd settled on Texas. So my forebears that left Scotland, where they had been in agriculture for generations and generations, they came kind of in the second wave. Okay. By the time they got to this sort of utopian location on the Brazos River, somewhere in present-day Bosque County, that the admiral convinced everybody would soon be navigable to the ocean.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, you can just take steamboats from Bosque County all the way to the Gulf.
Right.
When they finally got there, the entire experiment had gone up the spout. I mean, they were broke. Everybody had scattered.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, they found themselves marooned in Texas with looking for a plan B. But they were fairly well bankrolled by a successful brother that was in the Midlands of England, and they ended up buying property in Hill County. And so they, the decision to leave must have been gut-wrenching.
Yeah.
Then to get here and figure out, man,
this isn't going to work. Can you imagine making that?
There's no there. And not only that, you're dribbling kids all the way there. I mean, they lost 3 kids on the trip.
Wow.
And so just the story, that immigrant story, is pretty remarkable in my family.
That is amazing. There's a great book that I've read called The World Rushed In about the California Gold Rush.
Oh, yeah, that's a good book.
It's a great book. It's written from diaries. And the misery of the journey to get to the gold field. This guy was from New York, upstate New York, and he's going to go out and it's just, I mean, like it's just gut wrenching to read their accounts of these wagon trains, and they didn't really know how to get there necessarily at the time.
Yeah, ask the Donners about that.
Right? Yeah, like what? Should we go this way? But if we're going to go this way, we have to go through like the salt flats where there's no water for 50 miles. With all these horses and oxen, they brought too much stuff. They had to dump things on the way. Yep. And then they get to the gold field, and the guy realizes, you know what? This sucks.
Yeah, that's right. Where's my big nugget?
Right. This is miserable work, And I think he got enough, and he got the hell out of there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, now we can go to the gold fields by just going by Bitcoin.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
But with probably the same amount of luck.
Who's the biggest character historically in Texas?
Oh, there's so many.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a state the size of Germany, so it's like asking, who's the biggest character in, say, the history of France or the history of Turkey.
Yeah.
It depends on the era.
Right.
So I would say, there's a reason that there's a colossal statue of Sam Houston on I-45.
Right.
Larger than life character with some very interesting human foibles, which is pretty remarkable. One of my favorites is Jack Hayes. Jack Hayes is just a slip of a fella, but he was an innovative and brave guy that was involved in many a scrap, but figured out one day that he was getting a little too old to be a ranger life on the frontier, so he moves to California.
Oh, okay.
And so he actually dies in bed.
Yeah.
And of old age.
Wow.
Yeah, he goes out there and is sheriff in San Francisco, and then decides, you know what, I think I'll just have some grapevines and just
be relaxed.
Yeah, be a retired ranger.
The complex history of this is, what is LBJ's role? That's for Texans. It's like, I'm sure. I mean, here you have talk about larger than life figures.
Yeah.
Arguably, a lot of things don't get done without the will of LBJ. How does he rate?
Well, I mean, rate on a scale of what to what?
Right. I mean, yeah.
Despicable to evil, or
right? Is he despicable or is he a hero? I mean,
exactly.
And I think that the superheated political part of us wants to say, oh well, he was just a liberal Democrat, but I mean, he dominated the politics in the state for a long time, right?
He did. One of my friends who is a well-known columnist for the Houston Chronicle, Erica Greeter, really, she's an acquaintance and I'm an admirer because I like what she writes. But she's probably on the left end of the political spectrum, but she gives Texans props for being ultimately pragmatic.
Right.
Very practical folks. So love him or hate him, LBJ approached life in typical Texas fashion.
Right.
Yeah, there's rules and there's decorum and there's things like that you should follow, but there's also results.
Yeah.
And so how do I get to the results end of this story and kind of bypass a bunch of the rules and decorum ends of it? So he is not out of character.
Yeah.
And same could be said for Chester Nimitz. There's rules and decorum, and he understood the rules and decorum, but he also understood, we're going to have to look at this situation in a practical way.
Right.
And ended up winning the war in the Pacific. So
I mean, Nimitz gets, it's amazing to me that Nimitz gets sort of overshadowed by the generals.
Yeah.
But I mean, arguably, he's an innovative thinker. He's relying on data. I mean, he's very modern, in his approach.
Very modern, and knew how to marshal vast resources in absolutely inhospitable and difficult geography.
Right.
One of the things that struck me when I finally went to a Pacific battlefield is how much of nothing there is just on the outside of the gunnels of your boat. You know? So we were away from land. Okay, that's a given. Big ocean out there in the Pacific. But there weren't even contrails in the sky from aircraft.
That's amazing.
There was no sign of human habitation. We literally were diving off of one island that hadn't had people on it ever.
Right.
And I'm just thinking, there are places like this on Earth.
It's amazing.
It's absolutely amazing. So how do you wage war against those, amidst those vast distances where you can't get your airplane from point A to point B because you run out of gas before you get there, so you got to go point A to point N, point C, over here to point X, and then over to point B. There is a remarkable genius, practical genius, that I think was fostered right here in the stony soil of Kerr County and Gillespie County.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that upbringing here, and he's the guy too that had some failures early on in his naval career. I mean,
he grounded a destroyer, which should have gotten him cashiered.
Right. I mean, he should have been out of there, but he survived it
because he came up and said, "Look, I screwed up. I grounded the destroyer. I know why I grounded the destroyer, and I won't do it again."
Right.
And they said, "Well, okay, he's
all
a
right,
straight shooter.
You're good. You'll be fine. We're gonna put you in charge." We talk about battlefields and going to battlefields and being in those places. Which one stands out in your mind?
D-Day's tough to beat.
Yeah.
I've taken groups over there, and we've walked the entire length of Omaha Beach. I've crawled through the German trench lines. I've done bunker spelunking.
Wow.
That sort of thing.
It's amazing it's all still there, isn't it?
It's all still there, but, the battlefields at Guadalcanal, the gear's still there. It was too expensive to retrieve it.
Right.
So I just parked it underneath a coconut tree left it.
Left it. Wow.
And so, there's wildcats with the wings that you can still move, back and forth.
Wow.
And, P-39 Airacobras. I've never seen an airframe for an Airacobra. Under the water, it's all just laying there where they just bulldozed it over into the sea. So World War II, those are two places that resonate. Verdun resonates with me because it is such a human tragedy on a massive scale.
Right.
And the French being the French, they have an ossuary where they still turn up a body a week or bones a week at Verdun.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and this is a fight that's, 1917, 1916. They're still finding bones there. And so instead of putting them in the cemetery because they're unidentified, they just throw them in a great big bone box by sector. But the French being the French, there is a window that you can look through to see the pile of bones.
Wow.
And when you're seeing bones that still have, say, a helmet that's pinned to the skull by a big piece of shrapnel.
That's amazing.
You're just going, oh,
yeah,
this is real.
This is real.
This isn't story time.
Right.
These were real people. And, of course, Antietam is a remarkably haunted battlefield. Gettysburg is picturesque, but it doesn't do it for me like, say, Antietam.
Yeah.
But one of my specialties throughout my career is finding these uninterpreted battles, especially through Louisiana.
Interesting.
And what I like about that is I'm in the middle of a sugarcane field, and I can tell exactly how it all laid out.
Yeah.
Some farmer will come over and say, "Hey, I understand you're a historian. I dug this up out of my sugarcane field, and it's a 30-pound Parrott rifle shell." And I said, "Well, if it's a 30-pound Parrott rifle shell, it came from the USS Calhoun, and it was fired on this date.
Oh,
and it
wow.
probably landed right over there." And he said, "It did. It landed right over there by my turnaround on the turnaround."
That's
I said,
amazing.
"Yeah, that's probably where it would have landed."
The one that I went to Cold Harbor.
Ooh, that's chilling.
It is chilling, and what's chilling about it too is the entrenchments are still there.
Yep.
And I actually got kind of a guided tour there too, and there's a spot where they said was all the congealed blood ran down into the stream and was just full of blood. There was so many casualties. 7,000, U.S. killed and wounded in 30 minutes.
Yeah, in half an hour, and they're just mowed down.
Yeah. And you can see why, It's
But and what's remarkable about those numbers is they're doing it one shot at a time.
Yeah.
Muzzle loading.
Right.
I mean, it's not like they're shooting them with machine guns.
Right. But they're so close, I mean, it's like, what in the hell were you guys thinking?
Yeah.
So an interesting time as well. The Pacific one is interesting to me because I always think to myself, like, and I think they did think this as well, but like Peleliu and some of those places, like, why did you just skip it? Just leave those guys there to starve, essentially.
Well,
but
they did.
Mm-hmm.
So
a few
places.
of them, they did. I think, yeah, you're right. So after that, they kind of said, you know what?
There was probably 200,000 Japanese troops on New Guinea, New Guinea, New Britain, that area around the Bismarck Sea, that they just bypassed.
Yeah.
And they were completely out of supply. And so they ended up turning to cannibalism. They tried to grow their own fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
And, it was a terrible, miserable story for these Japanese units that got bypassed.
Yeah.
But Peleliu, places like around Guam and the Marshall Islands, all this is about air power.
Yeah.
Because that's what's winning that war in
Right.
the Pacific, backed up by sea power. But the sea power is just an adjunct to the naval air power.
Right. Iwo Jima makes sense because of the air power.
Yep.
Issues but I was just watching the thing last night on Iwo Jima, just how horrible the war was there, and it was interesting. One of the documentary I was watching was that they find all these Koreans there. They've been enslaved essentially, and these Koreans like, get me out of here, and they're very happy.
Can I go now?
And they're still in there, and so they just sealed the caves off, just an unbelievably difficult war. So,
I mean, talking about bypassing, you could have bypassed the Philippines and gone straight to Formosa.
Right. You could have, you could have done that, but
that would have changed the post-war world.
Yeah, it would have absolutely. And you had MacArthur wanted to be back home.
Maybe it was about putting on a good show.
Putting on a good show. But they absolutely annihilated Manila trying to get through that.
Oh, yeah. They just tore it up.
Interesting time. Well, and I guess also, too, I think people forget that the Philippines at that point is still sort of it's still an American territory. It's sort of like it's Puerto Rico, essentially. So it was important to MacArthur, who had lived there for many, many years. And talk about his own father. Talk about difficult stories to tell, how his own father was involved in suppressing Filipino insurrection and things like that. So. Good stuff. Hey, Don, thanks for joining us on this. I appreciate it very much. It's always good to talk.
Enjoy our chats.
It's always good. Are you going to go to Wolfmiller's now and go buy something?
I may.
50% off.
I know. It's crazy.
I have a stack that's this tall now of things I'm going to get. But
in an alternate universe, I'd buy that store.
Me too. All right. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you guys again tomorrow. We'll have Marty Leonard on. He will be talking. I don't know. We'll talk what's going on with local politics and his decision not to run for the re-election on the Kerrville Independent School District Board of Trustees. Thursday, Delane Siegerman will be back here hosting, and on a Friday, Karen Guerrero's got stuff cooked up for us over at Furry Friday at the Kerrville Pets Alive. So we're looking forward to that conversation as well. So with that, hopefully, don't forget to subscribe to the lead. Go to our website, go to our Facebook page. You'll find our links to that as well. And we'll hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us. See you guys again tomorrow.